So, I think it's safe to say that 2024 was a remarkably mediocre year for games. There's always going to be a few diamonds in the rough, but nothing about that entire year in gaming really excited me all that much. It always feels viscerally wrong to me whenever a year in gaming is so mediocre that remakes are in consideration for Game of the Year among many publications, as was the case with the Silent Hill 2 remake, but something occurred to me a little while ago. Despite owning it for over a decade, I've never actually played through the original Silent Hill 2 all the way. And I haven't played it at all in over a decade. I remember very little about it. I remember getting to the apartments. I think I got thrown down a garbage chute or something. But I'm a bit iffy on the details. Now, why did I never beat it? Well, despite Silent Hill 2 being among some of the most critically acclaimed games of all time, I was a giant wuss back then, and I couldn't handle it. It was too effective as a horror game, and I found it hard to get through. But last year I picked up the remake when it was on sale, I managed to get all the way through it, and it gave me pause for thought. A lot of what I heard from fans of the original game was that it was somewhat of a mediocre to decent remake in the grand scheme of things, and I think it might be interesting to get all my thoughts out there as someone who's played the remake but not the original, mostly, and see how the remake holds up as a game in its own right. Maybe you're in a similar boat to me and might find something interesting about this shared perspective. Welcome to the spooky season, ladies and gentlemen. This game came out on October 8th, 2024 and was made by Bloober Team. I'm not too familiar with their work. From what I can tell, they seem to have been an unremarkable lower-tier development studio until their first breakout hit Layers of Fear in 2016, a sort of first-person psychological thriller game from what I can tell. From what I understand, it wasn't a particularly long game, but it was at least more than a playable teaser, if you catch me. After which it looks like they specialized in similar types of games before being given this project. So they really moved up in the world. I guess this was their big test to see if they could hang with the big boys, so to speak, because they certainly weren't proven developers at this level. But considering how far they had come by this point, it's not unreasonable to assume that they were gonna rise to the occasion. Now, despite not being overly familiar with the game itself, I am somewhat familiar with the story of Silent Hill 2 as it's somewhat famous. Proud Mop Top owner James Sunderland gets a letter from his wife to come to Silent Hill, which was their special getaway spot. Was being the operative word there on account of her having been dead for 3 years from that damn disease.
Mary died of that damn disease 3 years ago.
They're purposefully vague about the circumstances surrounding his wife's death for a very good reason that I won't spoil, but if you're at all familiar with this game, you probably already know. Hell, even as I'm talking around it, it's probably easy to guess. Upon coming to Silent Hill, he finds it crawling with monsters, sometimes even crawling monsters. Along his journey, he finds several people who are on their own journeys through Silent Hill for various reasons, all of whom are characterized by some level of trauma and or some level of being completely unhinged.
Ain't no big deal. Just put the gun to their head and pow.
I don't know how much of the story was changed from the original to this version. I doubt it was that much, and if this is considered one of the more critically acclaimed stories in the history of gaming, I can tell why. It's a very compelling mystery that gradually unfolds in multiple ways with multiple people playing different roles. Every character carries some sort of larger significance to the narrative, much of which you don't actually realize until you know the twist and how every character ties into it. You're never quite sure what to make of the other characters in the story because you can easily tell they are very disturbed people, and as you make your way through the story, you're never quite sure if these people are looking to seek some level of emotional support from you, or if they're gonna try to kill you. Like during my first playthrough, I was convinced that Maria was gonna turn into a monster and be a major boss fight. Much like what Eddie does, just minus the monster part in that case, though he does look pretty disgusting. Aside from the fact that Maria looks like your dead wife, she seems to be a bit too invested in you for it to be innocent. Plus, she's shown to be less than willing to stay dead. Incidentally, I won't spoil if I was correct. I was curious at one point and actually read into the plot synopsis of the Born from a Wish bonus scenario. From what I can tell based on that, Maria is sort of the mental manifestation of James's longing for his dead wife. Particularly from a sexual point of view, hence why Maria looks like his dead wife but more deliberately sexualized. And realizing that, it's easy to fall down a rabbit hole of not being quite sure what is and is not real in this game. Every time you think you have all the answers, Silent Hill changes the questions, and so at any given time it's impossible to know what's really happening. Is this all a figment of James's imagination? Is it real? Or is it somewhere in between? Regardless of where you draw the line, one thing is definitely true. It becomes obvious that Silent Hill is a malevolent force that's deliberately trying to mess with James. It's not just about the monsters trying to kill you, it's about James being punished. And towards the end of the game, you realize that much of the malevolence is born out of James himself feeling a repressed guilt, and he has to overcome his guilt to overcome the forces that threaten to kill him within the town. Hence why one of the final bosses can only end when James himself realizes that he no longer needs them for punishment. There's a lot of layers to this, and I would say it's very easy to spend hours digging, and since I'm a noob, there's no doubt probably hundreds of video essays about the symbolism and all the hidden meanings of all these different characters and plot beats within the story. And the best part is, you're kind of discovering everything alongside James himself, who is a stranger to this scenario despite being the instigator. James is kind of a reactionary character through a lot of the game, just blindly trundling through from point to point, being really unsure of what he's doing or why he's doing it, other than the fact that it will in some way bring him closer to his overall goal of finding Mary. But I think it's a rare case where a reactionary character is more compelling for being one because it shows him to be this desperate figure. Someone who's willing to go along with the world around him messing with him just to get to where he needs to go. He believes he's desperate to find answers about his dead wife, suddenly seemingly springing back to life and sending him a message, but really, he doesn't even realize that he himself is subconsciously desperate to overcome his repressed guilt, and maybe find redemption. And despite the fact that he's generally a reactionary character, that doesn't mean he doesn't have a personality of his own. One of the things you'll notice throughout the game is that he has a short temper and will snap at certain NPCs for relatively benign reasons.
We met at the hospital last year.
Stop lying! Laura, I'm sorry.
Perhaps his temper is part of what gives him his massive guilt, if you catch me. And his internalized guilt is represented by one of the main antagonists, Pyramid Head. If you know anything about Silent Hill, chances are it's Pyramid Head. From what I understand, it was based on the town's long-dead executioner, and now he's been reborn as the mental manifestation of James's own guilt. And you can't help but feel Pyramid Head is messing with James throughout the game, because as it goes on, there are multiple instances where he could easily kill James right then and there. But it's almost as if he wants James to suffer more before taking him out. So the entire game is this wealth of intrigue and symbolism gradually unraveling itself into a central point. That being the grand mystery surrounding everything, and even if I don't necessarily get something or understand its significance to the larger story, I can acknowledge the fact that there is something there. Like Angela. She's probably the most normal character you meet by default, but even she is a manically depressed sexual abuse survivor who at one point almost decides to stab you in a moment of mental anguish. What does she represent? And what's the significance of her walking up a flaming staircase into an uncertain future at the end of the game? I was surprised to find out that that conclusion to the character was also in the original, where she basically walks into a flaming staircase and is never seen again. But is Angela real? And if so, are the things that are happening to her along her journey through Silent Hill relevant to James, or is it her own journey of guilt and self-loathing? Then there's Laura, the little girl. Once again, is she real, and what is her significance to the grander overall story? She's the one innocent and untainted character in the story, even if she is kind of a horrible kid, but what are you gonna do? She's a kid. But she seemingly also knows Mary, and is implied to have met her after she died.
What you got there?
None of your business. You didn't love Mary anyway.
What? Hey, wait!
But what does that mean? What does she know, and more to the point, what is her significance in the overall story? There's a lot to unravel here, and there's a lot going on here. It's all very good, but you probably don't need me to tell you that. Aside from it basically being canon to gaming discourse that Silent Hill 2 has a tremendous story, I don't think it was ever in doubt that the story was going to be good on account of the fact that from what I can tell, this is pretty much a shot-for-shot remake of the original story. So whatever's good about this story was probably already good, but for what it's worth, it's still a compelling story that keeps you hooked, and only gets more interesting once it's over. But the thing that isn't too much of a shot-for-shot remake would be the gameplay, because I remember enough about the original game to know it kind of had a wonky third-person overhead camera that wasn't conducive to action whatsoever. Meanwhile, the Silent Hill 2 remake does what a lot of remakes of quirky games have done and just copied Resident Evil 4. Yep, if you have the two games side by side, the camera is pretty much the exact same. Even the characters look surprisingly similar now that I'm looking at it. But if you go into this game expecting a Resident Evil 4 level action game, you will be sorely disappointed. You don't even get the first gun until a couple hours in. Before that, you're entirely reliant on the melee combat, which I will describe as a violent do-si-do, because what you're basically doing is haphazardly swinging your plank whenever you see an opening, and whenever you see an enemy lunging towards you, that's your cue to hit the dodge button. As far as melee engines go, haphazard is definitely the word. But that's absolutely by design, considering James is just some guy, so his attempts to fight would be as panicky and desperate as he is generally. And I like the little touches they put on top of the melee combat, like James's grunts of frenzied exertion, and the way you can continue to stomp a mud hole in enemies after they're dead. Though you're probably gonna need to, because enemies have a habit of coming back from the dead, which is really annoying. I've heard that apparently stomping on enemies after they're dead can contribute to you getting one of the bad endings, which I find ridiculous. If I'm in this situation, I'm stomping on those suckers until I know they're dead. And the game doesn't do a good job of letting me know they're dead. Though for what it's worth, the bad ending in question, I wouldn't even consider a bad ending because I find it fitting. I'm not going to say the melee combat is outstanding so much as I would say it's fitting. It certainly feels good to swing the plank or the pipe around, so it's good for what it is, but it's not particularly elaborate. But still, the game really emphasizes the hopelessness through its melee combat and by deliberately making ammo scarce. You have to basically explore every nook and cranny in this game in order to find ammo, and each pickup only gives you a small handful of bullets. The handgun ammo is the most abundant, but I think the most ammo I ever got in a single pickup was like 6 bullets. So you usually can't rely on it. It's not to say you can't shoot at least some of the enemies over using your melee, but you need to learn to at the very least keep a balanced playstyle. Especially because you want to keep a good amount of ammo for the bosses, since fighting them with melee is death on toast half the time. Despite the lack of ammo, I'd say the gun combat is much like the melee combat, good if fairly basic. The guns have a good kick to them, but I wish they had more detail in the gun combat. Like, I really wish you could blow off heads or limbs, because aside from fitting the tone, the most that happens when you shoot someone is they get covered in blood, but otherwise they don't show any signs of damage. It just doesn't feel as visceral as it probably should. I'd imagine it was probably a step too far for the budget though, but otherwise the gun combat is as effective as it needs to be. And the combat generally is really good as far as emphasizing the horror, because you do perpetually feel at a disadvantage, and some enemies can take you by surprise since there are a lot of claustrophobic environments in this game, and even when you don't have to deal with the fog, most areas are at the very least dark enough that you can't see enemies 20 feet in front of you. Which kind of meant that anytime I entered a room, I would pull out my gun and scan the area before proceeding. With that said though, I don't think the game is particularly hard. I was playing this game on normal difficulty, so maybe it was my fault, but outside of the bosses, I think I only died once in the entire game, and that was really my own fault. I flew too close to the sun on attempting to preserve healing items, and I got caught by what I think is called a mannequin, who managed to have a perfect storm of counters to what I was doing at that particular moment. And I also wasn't playing particularly carefully. Basically, I had to go out of my way to die in this case. Most of that has to do with the fact that the game loads you down with healing items. I actively went out of my way to try and preserve my healing items, but even if you're a little bit more reckless, it's still very easy to get healing items into the double digits in a very short amount of time. The only time you're in danger of running out is at the beginning of the game before you have a good stockpile, but you'll pretty much naturally get a stockpile without even trying. Even if you do die, you just get sent back to the last time you saved, and there's no limit to the amount of times you can save near as I can tell. So there's a lot of cases where you can simply run back to wherever is the nearest save point whenever you make substantial progress. Plus, the game autosaves after major events. There are a few times in the game where you don't have immediate access to a save point, and in those instances it can be a bit harrowing, but I also find that going back and redoing things you've already done if you need to load the game or whatever is always quicker the second time. Plus, there's also the radio. I'm not sure if it makes the game easier necessarily, but it's certainly worth bringing up. The radio you have will play static whenever there's an enemy nearby. I think it only plays static if the enemy in question is aggroed. Hence why certain enemies that are deliberately made to take you by surprise don't come up on the radio until they're attacking you. But either way, this means you're pretty much always aware of when to be on your guard, and as such, enemies theoretically can't take you by surprise. Though you can turn the radio off if you want. But I don't think it's their intention to make the game easier. I think what they're trying to do is make you uneasy at the idea that there's danger lurking around somewhere, but you have no idea what it is or where it is. Sometimes it's literally just a giant cockroach. And considering this is a horror game, this is pretty much where the game lives or dies, and in all honesty, I think the atmosphere in this game is pretty great. The sound design is great, with all these lingering atmospheric sounds and music playing in the background. That combined with the great visual design with either fog, darkness, or environmental decay being the focus at any given time, it creates a lot of eerie tension around you where you're just waiting for something bad to happen. Whenever there's an eerie stillness around you, you're sitting there waiting for the other shoe to drop. Ironically though, I think the tension sort of deflates once things do happen, i.e. when you're attacked. Because I feel more safe during combat in the knowledge that it's just combat and nothing else is going to happen in the meantime. Because chances are you already know exactly what to do during combat and how to deal with any given enemy. Plus, as terrifying as these enemy designs are at first, they kinda lose their luster after the 100th time. But yeah, these scuttly monsters that look like bags of flesh haphazardly sewn together are creepy when they're scuttling about, but once you know you can just hit them with a couple of melee shots, they cease to be effective. It's a similar case with every enemy. Even with the more damage spongy enemies, like these things which I won't even hazard to try and describe, it's the calm before the storm that's more terrifying than the storm itself. Even the boss fights aren't particularly tough once you know what you're doing. They may look big, but as long as you have a halfway decent understanding of how the dodge mechanic works, you're pretty much untouchable, and they always take slightly fewer shots to kill them than you think it does. Besides, it's the moments between gameplay when the game actually does some things genuinely unexpected. Something will collapse, the lighting will change, or in certain areas, the entire environment around you will start messing with you. Like this moment where all the walls around you begin to break, and then the environment turns into this breathing structure of flesh. That's effective horror. Lessened by the fact that you're usually in little to no danger, but that doesn't stop the fear in the moment. Although I will say, if you are afraid of low frame rates, then sections like this might scare you because the game is kind of poorly optimized to where even on performance mode you get frame rate drops. There's also a lot of background details that run at a lower frame rate to the rest of the game, which can be a bit jarring. But as much as I can point that out, it doesn't really affect my experience. So yeah, the game tends to have peaks and valleys as far as its fear factor. The atmosphere is first rate, but I acknowledge that I'm definitely not breaking any new ground with that take. But as far as being effectively scary, it's a bit more hit than miss, but it is still hit and miss. Though that probably will vary from person to person. The final aspect of the game's design is in its puzzles. I think the puzzles are a bit of a mixed bag because some of these puzzles are just collecting items and putting them in the appropriate slot. The opening portion of the game where you have to find a record, a coin, and a button in order to put the record machine back together to use it to get a key is probably the worst part of the game. Because while you may only get a small handful of named locations that they insist you look, many of these locations are big, and as such, it's very easy to completely miss something and not know where you're supposed to go. In this case, I got up to the dilapidated apartments, I opened a door, and I saw the chain lock. I thought I was supposed to get a bolt cutter to open the door and find the puzzle item inside, but I accidentally forgot to look in the bathroom in the next room to find a conspicuous hole that I was supposed to reach into. So I ran around for an hour not being sure where to go or what to do, because I was convinced I was supposed to somehow open the door before finally going back to the apartments as a last resort. But I would say the puzzle design tends to get better after that. There is still plenty of finding the item to put in the item slot type of puzzles, but there are plenty of actually really clever moments of deduction. One moment that sticks in my head is this puzzle where you have to follow a chain attached to a combination lock to a room of a psych ward patient, and you read a note from them which has 3 separate drawings going down the page. One of a sink, one of a clock, and one of a light. I noticed there was a big conspicuous number 1 on the page, so presumably that was the first number. Then I went outside the room to find a clock, which freaked out and summoned a whole bunch of monsters when I turned it to 2 o'clock. Then I looked in the sink and found there to be 6 pills. And I looked at the light outside of the room to find it blinks in a specific pattern exactly twice before resetting. A big 1 on the page, 2 o'clock, 6 pills, and 2 flickers. And based on the orientation of the pictures, I put it together as 1622. That's when the puzzles are at their best, when you're free to deduce these various codes by yourself. Another couple of highlights would be, first of all, that puzzle in the hospital where you're simply given the hint nurses, doctors, trees. Only through wandering around will you find that there are pictures in the hospital lobby that you can examine. One with nurses, one with doctors, and one with trees. And through that, you can deduce the code is 724 based on the amount of relevant figures in each of the pictures. Or then there's that one particular segment where you have to get 3 medallions and arrange them in a specific way to solve a couple of riddles. Then there's that safe in the director's office in the hospital. After you get 3 bracelets to put on a mannequin's wrist, you have to arrange them in a certain way. There's no clue, but it's fairly intuitive if you don't overthink it, which was, generally my problem, that you can arrange the bracelets in the numbers that align with the damage to the mannequin's wrist behind the bracelets. However, that's not it. Shortly after this, you have to find a code to unlock the director's safe. But all you have are a bunch of symbols. However, in an adjoining room, you can find out what numbers each symbol corresponds to by arranging a stack of books in a pattern to make up a picture. Then you use those symbols to type out the number from the bracelets. There's a lot of plate spinning here, but man, is it satisfying to figure out the first time. But unfortunately, the puzzle design doesn't often get to that point. Sometimes they'll outright give you the answer once you're done with a series of item exchanges. There's one particularly elaborate series of item exchanges, which I'm not the biggest fan of, where you need to find a paint can, a can opener, and a bolt cutter. You take the bolt cutter to get inside this area of the hotel garden, you grab a light bulb that's sitting there, and you use the can opener and the can of paint to paint the light bulb red. After which you can replace this broken light bulb with the regular red light bulb, which will then spell out the answer to the combination lock on the luggage on the bed. I thought to myself, there's no way they'll just outright give me the answer to the puzzle, right? Nope, that was indeed the answer to the puzzle. In certain other instances, the puzzle design can be a bit brain dead, like the scales bit where you have to arrange different weights to open different doors. There are certain instances where the answer is obvious but kind of obtuse, like in this room where you have to arrange a couple of books based on the orientation of a couple different figures in the picture in the same room, except you have to arrange them in reverse vertical orientation than what you would think it would be, and the only indication is the symbol in the middle corresponding to the direction that the figure in the middle is standing. And there's one particular puzzle that I have a bit of a grudge against in this one spot before the labyrinth. I'm used to some indication of what the answer to a puzzle might be in the surrounding environment, whether it be a clue on a piece of paper or on a wall somewhere. So I didn't even bother examining the actual keypad. It wasn't until I did so that I realized that there were 3 numbers that were a different color, and I just typed them in order, and that was the code. So it's simultaneously brain dead but also unintuitive. So overall, kind of a mixed bag puzzle-wise. This is on normal difficulty, by the way. I'm not sure how different the puzzle design is on hard. But even still, I'd say there's enough quality in the puzzle design to balance out for the weaker aspects, and even when the puzzles are basic item exchanges, that usually doesn't make them bad outside of a few specific instances. At worst, they're usually just mediocre. And when it comes to puzzle design, mediocrity with moments of brilliance is better than what most games will do. And really, when you examine all the systems in this game together, there is a lot to enjoy if you're a fan of these sort of things. I don't think I would enjoy this game as much as I had it not been for the atmosphere and the mood of this game being as effective as it is, but the fact of the matter is, an experience can be carried by a single aspect, as long as the rest of the experience is good enough, and there's a lot of this game that's more than simply good enough. There is a lot of really good stuff here, but I think there is still one major overarching issue with the Silent Hill 2 remake as a game, which is that I feel it's a bit too bloated for what it is. Once again, I feel I need to clarify this because some people will automatically assume that the longer a game is, the better, but not every game is made equally. Something like The Witcher can get away with being a 70-hour game because it's a big open world with a lot of characters and a lot of story to tell. Meanwhile, horror experiences almost always benefit from keeping themselves succinct, because the essence of horror is the unknown. It's easier to get under a player's skin if they don't know what's coming. And the problem I find with this game is it doesn't keep things fresh often enough to keep the scares coming through the entire runtime. As you start the game and you're wandering through Silent Hill, it is very unnerving because you're not sure what to expect. You see these scary monsters through the fog and you're not quite sure what to make of them, and you're not quite sure what to make of the game generally as you basically stumble around blindly looking for the puzzle items to get you to the next area. But it doesn't take that long for you to get a good groove going to where you know exactly how to fight these enemies, and at that point they become more of a nuisance than scary. I would say the scariest part of the game is probably the first apartment section because it starts out really effectively. There's a storm on the way, and you're basically railroaded into the last spot you haven't been able to go to at this point in the game. This section has the most organic scare I experienced in the game, full stop. As you're walking towards the end of this hallway to a mandatory area, the radio will play the loudest static you will have heard up to this point. And you see something off into the distance, something red and dimly lit, and as you walk up to it, it's just Pyramid Head standing right there. The first time you see him. He's not doing anything, he's just standing there for you to discover. You're not expecting it, and it's a moment that really got me. And when you actually go around the corner to get to him, he's gone. That was spooky. Then within the apartments, you're faced with claustrophobic hallways, petrifying darkness, and the first new enemy to be introduced, the aforementioned mannequins. The type of enemies to hide around corners and really like to pop out at you. But once again, it doesn't take that long for you to learn the mannequins' patterns and when to look out for them. And at that point, they become the biggest nuisance in the game because they are basically clockwork jump scares at that point. And not even jump scares that take you by surprise because you're expecting it after a while. And that kind of sets up the pattern for the entire game to come. Every time you go to a new area, they introduce a new enemy and maybe a few new area-specific gimmicks, but they aren't particularly hard to learn how to deal with. And with each subsequent new addition, I find myself less and less scared because I feel like regardless of which new addition comes up, I can handle it. And that's because the game gives you enough time with each new idea for it to become mundane. I just felt like the game really didn't have much to surprise me with after a while, and it doesn't help that some of these areas go on forever. You have to go through the normal version and the otherworld version of 5 separate locations, and each of these locations individually can take 1 to 2 hours. Which means not even accounting for the time spent between these major areas, this game can easily get to upwards of 15 hours plus. And I feel like it has enough content to fill about half that space. Hence why, when you look at how long to beat for both these two versions of the game, the original runs about half as long. So clearly, this is an issue unique to the remake. There are some times when I feel the freshness of a new area really runs out and I find myself going through without much feeling at all. I'm not gonna say this remake invokes apathy necessarily because when it gets good, it's really good, but I feel like there was too much here and as a result, the game kind of loses the plot as far as surprise and the mystery that's sort of required in a horror game to actually scare you. Creepy visual design and superb sound design can only do so much when you've gotten so used to your surroundings that they become somewhat mundane. As a result, I feel like this game would have benefited from cutting down its runtime somewhat, so you don't have time to get used to the ideas, and therefore the scare factor and the freshness of new sections would overlap somewhat, making this game feel generally more succinct and simply more enjoyable on average. But even despite that, there was something to this game that was pushing me forward. I almost feel like me and James Sunderland had the same mentality because I was pushing forward without knowing why, and I actually found that the game was hard to put down at times. I remember thinking I was going to finish the labyrinth before going to bed, and I found myself halfway through the normal version of the hotel before realizing it was 3 AM and I was supposed to be in bed. I guess this game does have a lingering level of mechanical enjoyment to it, even once you get used to the various aspects of the game. And even while the game is definitely too long, there are plenty of times when they do break up the normal flow that you expect with something really cool, which does give the game a series of peaks and valleys and plenty of memorable moments. That said though, I really don't see myself coming back to this game anytime soon. I just feel like it's too much of a time investment to come back to. Like, I'm aware of the fact that there's something like 7 different endings, but really, you can get the essential experience by playing through the game once and then looking up the other endings on YouTube. Incidentally, the dog ending is possibly my favorite joke ending in the entire history of video games, where if you go through New Game Plus and fulfill certain criteria, it turns out the entirety of the game was an elaborately orchestrated prank. And it was a prank orchestrated by a Shiba Inu for some reason. I'm not one to generally lament how things currently are compared to how they used to be, but I do certainly miss when devs could just be a little bit more irreverent like this. You almost never get joke endings like this in modern games because everything is too expensive, so providing funding for New Game Plus is usually a bridge too far, let alone several alternate joke endings. But either way, I look forward to the remake of the first game they're making because I also haven't played that one outside of the first couple minutes, but I would say it's probably a prime candidate for this style of remake just based off its age alone. That's all I've got. If you like what I do here and want to support the channel, you can leave a like, tell me what you think in the comment section, subscribe, and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends.